Genesis chapter 15. God's covenant with Abram. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram also said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I shall gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these things to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and ill-treated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking brazier with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenzites, the Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites. I know.
I was trying to be merciful to you and stop at verse 18, so you didn't have to read all
Right.
of that.
Oh, shall I go on? Shall I go on? Well, there's only a couple more to do. Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jesuites. Yeah, I probably should have stopped. Apologies.
Am I allowed to say that? That was a load of height.
Yes. I knew he said it was to 18, but
No,
I
you're a
thought
glutton.
that was all it.
Well done, well done. I think the reading started that Ed read something like this. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. So let's set the scene. After what? It's handy to know. Why did God tell Abram not to be afraid? Well, if we'd read chapter 14, which many of us will have done, Abram had just been involved in a pretty bloody war. It was tough. It went on a long time. He'd actually been victorious over the armies of 4 kings. And quite frankly, Abraham and his men were knackered. That's a Hebrew word. They were tired, they were worn out, they were a bit dispirited. And Abram, he hasn't changed his name yet, I must remember that. Abram was fearful that the 4 kings would regroup and have another go. And he knew that him and his men really weren't ready for that. They weren't sure they could withstand another attack from the 4 kings. And so God said, I am your shield, your very great reward. That was God speaking to Abram when Abram had just come out of those wars. I am your shield and your very great reward. And this is God speaking. God was speaking words of comfort and support to Abram because he knew how he was feeling. Now, of all the ways I might have expected Abram to respond to those words from God, those words that God spoke to him, what Abram said was, but sovereign Lord, what can you give me? Which I thought was an odd response, really. He's just been comforted by God and that's it. But what can you give me? It sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? Unless you know the backstory. Because there's always a backstory to responses like that. And about 10 years before, we're talking about now, 10 years before, God had given Abram a promise. And the promise was that he would be the father of a great nation. That was 10 years ago, at least, he was given that promise. And so far, nothing. No kids. Not one. Not a hint of a child. Which you could say makes talk about a great nation seem a little bit empty. Great nations have got to start with at least one person, surely. So Abram said, sort of politely reminding God, in case God had forgotten, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? You haven't given me any children. And by the way, it's not for the one to try in. I'm sure that's the case. As it stands, said Abram, a servant in my household will be my heir. Now, there's a couple of things we can learn from this little episode. First of all, it's okay to question God. God didn't get angry with Abram. And Abram, I thought he was, come on, God, you promised me some at once. Where is it? We can do that. God's big enough. He can take it. He doesn't mind. He understands. And also, we learn that God often tends to work on a time scale and to a timetable that's very different to the one we might have in our head. And that's hard to get used to sometimes. And maybe we can get a little impatient. I think Abram was 10 years ago. And never mind. But they hadn't got a child. And maybe sometimes like Abram, we're in need of a bit of assurance. A bit of a reminder that God is still on the case. He is still there. He is still with us. He is still working. This man, by the way, this is how God answers Abram. So Abram's bothered that it will be a servant who gets everything, who's the heir. And God just says simply, this man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. Now, he made a promise, but let's notice what he didn't promise. He didn't promise it would happen any quicker. He didn't give any further information about the timescale or the timetable to put Abram's mind at rest. He just said a statement of fact and left it to Abram to either believe or not believe. What did God do now? It gets stranger. It gets more weird. So here's Abram having had that answer. Yep, this man will not be your heir, but a son is your own flesh. He will be. And then God said, "How outside, Abram? Look up at the stars and count them." What? Look up at the stars and is this a joke? What is going on? An astronomy lesson? I mean, what is it about this? Count the stars indeed. God knew it wasn't possible. Abram knew it wasn't possible. Abram knew that God knew it wasn't possible. So why on earth did God ask him? Abraham kept his silence. I don't know whether he started to count or not, but he certainly didn't finish. And God simply said to him, "So shall your offspring be." That was another promise. As many as the stars are, God just said, "So shall your offspring be." Now I have to say, if they had microphones in those days, it was a mic drop moment that was quite something. We've all had that feeling when we've looked up on a clear night and seen the stars and the other things that are up there, galaxies and all of that stuff. You think, wow. And then if you think a bit more, you think, and that just goes, it goes on, it's massive. It's huge. Wow. So shall your offspring be. Mic drop moment. And in that moment, when God said that, Abram knew that something momentous had happened in his heart, in his soul, in his mind. Because the Bible says, he believed the Lord. He trusted him. And God credited it to him as righteousness. Hooray indeed. Hooray indeed. We should all be shouting hooray. We've all benefited from that in here today. He believed the Lord. Something happened and God saw that it had happened and he credited it. Isn't it difficult to say credited it? He credited it as righteousness to Abram. Abram believed and Abram trusted. And on that basis, he was credited with righteousness. He now needed no further information. He trusted. He knew what he had to do. He believed. He believed that God would do what God said he'd do and that God would do it in his own timetable and in his own way. Now this combination of belief and trust, that's faith. Belief and trust, that is faith. It's exactly the same kind of faith that puts us in a right standing with God, in a right relationship with God, the God of Abram. That belief and trust, I think, is probably expressed really simply and powerfully in the New Testament, in John 4:49 and 50. Many of you will know this story. The man said to Jesus, "Sir, come down before my child dies." "Go," Jesus replied, "your son will live." And the man took Jesus at his word and departed. He believed him and he trusted him enough to set off back home. So the trust was the belief in action. And that's what Abram did at that moment. He changed. God saw it and God did what God does when he sees that faith. He credited to him as righteousness. In other words, Abram was in a right standing with God, a right relationship with God, his Father, at that time. He discovered it in that moment. He probably couldn't have explained it. He probably couldn't have written it down, but he knew it had happened, and God knew it had happened. Belief and trust in action. I guess he had the Old Testament equivalent. If you're a Methodist, you'll know what this is about. He had the Old Testament equivalent of the warmed heart. His heart was strangely warmed and he knew God was at work. He understood, I believe, in that moment, from all that follows, we can see he understood that he was in the presence of a faithful, promise-keeping God. A God who did what he promised. A God who was faithful. Hence all the songs, pretty much every song we've sung this morning has had a theme of faithfulness running through it. Abraham knew that he knew that he knew that he could trust God. No matter the timetable, no matter the means. God would do it his way, but he'd do it. This is a God, the God of Abram and our God, who we can trust because of his faithfulness. And until Abram just knew that God was faithful, he was struggling. But once you know, in your heart, in your mind, in your soul, our God is faithful. He has shown his faithfulness, and we'll look at that in a moment. And because he is faithful, we can trust him. Because he is faithful, we can trust him. Now, we sort of have to wait another 200 years, 2,000 years, give or take, for this truth that Abram experienced to be fully revealed through Abram's seed, who of course was Jesus. Paul tells us that in Romans. We're not going to go up to Romans yet, but we had to wait so long to have this truth fully revealed. Now, I'm going to read from, has anybody ever read the complete Jewish Bible? No? It's a Bible that Jewish Christians use. It's a great Bible because they get the language right. They actually understood the language. So some of our Bibles, where let's just say the translators play fast and loose sometimes, they give you a footnote if you look at it and read it, and it tells you what it could say. These guys get it right. So Romans 3:22 from the complete Jewish Bible. See if you can spot the difference. A righteousness that comes from God through the faithfulness of Yeshua, the Messiah, to all who continue trusting, and it makes no difference whether one is a Jew or a Gentile. The righteousness that comes through what? The faithfulness of Jesus. And when Paul is talking about us being saved, it often reads in a number of the translations, we are saved through faith or by faith. That Greek phrase equally can read through the faithfulness of Christ. It's important we get that right. Has anybody here ever been given a house? Somebody's just come along and says, here, have my house. No. Weird lot. Should that happen, or were that to happen, you would then have a choice to make, a choice you didn't have before they gave you the house. Should I take it? Should I take this house? Should I live in this house? You've got decisions. But the only reason you have those decisions, the only reason you've got those choices to make is because somebody before you actually put in the work and built that house. And their building of that house, that they've just given you, by the way, gives you some choices. I want to suggest that Jesus and his faithfulness in going to the cross, because if you remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, he didn't have to. He could have got up and walked away, but he didn't. He was faithful, and his faithfulness in going to the cross, he did the work that gives us the choice to follow him, to trust him, to believe in him. But without that work having been done, we wouldn't have had that choice. And that's why I believe the complete Jewish Bible gets it right. This righteousness, this right standing that we enjoy with God, this relationship that we enjoy with God, comes through the faithfulness of Yeshua, the Messiah. He did the work and invites us to choose. We still have to do it just like Abram. Belief and trust in practice. Because he's built the house, he did it. Jesus did it. So Abram had this amazing revelation, and any one of us that's a Christian today has had that same revelation. We know it's no work of ours that has put us in a right standing with God. It's the faithfulness of Jesus. That's why. And we simply accept the invitation he makes to us. Come, follow me. Trust me. See what I'm like. We'll have a break. That's part one. Let's sing again. What a faithful God. We keep into the theme. And we'll have it quieter just so it's prayerful. By the way, for having a break in the sermon, I'm hoping you won't notice I've broken my own 20-minute rule. I've got an intermission invitation right now. We've heard of Jesus and his faithfulness. He's done what he said he would do. And if there's anybody here today who really doesn't know what Abram experienced, what many people in this room have experienced, that warmed heart, that knowledge that Jesus has done it. He's been to the cross. He's paid for our sin and our guilt, and he's inviting us to follow him. He's inviting us to get to know him, and he's waiting to get to know you. Now, if that's you, then don't listen to anything else I say. Just focus on that and invite Jesus into your life. But the rest of us will move on. So, Abram has had these amazing newfound truths, experiences, words from God. It's all been happening. And how does Abram respond to these amazing things that are going on? Well, verse 8 says, "But Lord," said Abram, "how?" What? Oh, he's back again with the buts and the hows. "How can I know that I will gain possession of this land?" So here's Abram, who's just been credited with righteousness. He's in a right standing with God. He's faithful and he's trusting him. Oh, but I really need to know stuff, God. I want to know. What's wrong with a man? I'll tell you what's wrong with him. He's just like us. And we're just like him. And God knows what Abram was like. And God knows what we're like. And he cuts Abram some slack. And the Bible calls that grace. And he cuts us some slack. And that's grace as well. Every day of our lives, we are living in the slack that God has cut us, called grace. And that's where Abram found himself right now. So here he is. He said, look, okay, Lord, you've said I can have the land. How can I know? I want to know for certain, for absolutely sure, no doubts. Well, you're going down the wrong track there, Abram. God's not going to play that game with you. He'll give you a peace of heart, but he might not tell you all his plans. And then, the most weird and amazing thing starts to happen. Basically, at this point, God gives Abram a shopping list. And he says, Abram, pop out and get me these, will you? Yes, God. What, God? Bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, and make sure each is 3 years old. And while you're on, bring a dove and a young pigeon. Right, God. I'm off. I may be some time. But Abram knew where this was leading. He was familiar with how covenants worked. And covenants weren't peculiar to his people. They were happening in all the nations around him as well. They knew about covenants. But nobody ever knew about a covenant like this one was going to be. This is the covenant, if I can use this word, that trumps all covenants. That's what Paul says. Not in so many words, but that's what he says in Romans. So Abram knew this was leading to something special. Now, the Hebrew word for covenant is berith, or berit, depending on which way you want to pronounce it. And it's a word that has two really, really important shades of meaning. The first is to cut, and the second is to bind. To cut and to bind. And it's one of the most important words in the Bible. These types of covenants, as I've said, were quite common to that region. Right, as my daughter-in-law says to her children, listening ears on. I might be asking you questions about the next bit. When two parties wanted to make a covenant, animals were sacrificed by both parties. They were cut in two, and the halves were set about that distance apart, so that two men, and it would have been men, two men could walk in between those cut halves. And this was all, they knew this, that's how it works. When the halves were laid out on the ground, there they were, and you walked through them. Now, the cutting of the animals, the sacrifice of the animals, sorry if you're a vegetarian, but that's what they did. The sacrificing of the animals was the cutting part. Hence, they were cut in half. Don't know where that tradition comes from, but that's what it was. They were cut. What happened next was the two parties making the covenant would each walk, one that way and one that way, through those dead animals. And that's the binding part. Because what those two parties in that covenant, that agreement they were making, were saying by walking through it was, if I don't stick to this agreement, may I become like those animals, i.e. dead. These covenants were serious things. Because the people making them were literally saying, if I'm the one that breaks it, kill me. So you didn't do it lightly, these covenants. So Abram sort of knew there was a covenant about to happen. This was a serious commitment. And Abram knew this, so it wasn't that strange to him. But his mind was about to be blown, basically. The sun was setting, it says. Abraham had been sent out. He'd come back with his animals. They'd been cut in half. They'd been laid out exactly as he'd been told. So far, so normal. And then, when the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. And then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain." Now, at this point, Abram may have been expecting good news. God said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own. They'll be enslaved and mistreated there." I don't think that's what Abram wanted to hear, personally. He was wanting a different answer to that, but that's what he got. "But," says God, "I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites," they're back, "has not yet reached full measure." Now, here's the bit. "When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces." Now, the covenant I described to you that was familiar with the other countries, what's different about this one? I told you I'd ask you questions. Only one. And Stephen, were you going to say only one? Abraham's, at this point in the proceedings, Abraham's job was to sleep, it seems. He'd been put to sleep and he was asleep. So, only one entity walked through those animals. And in doing so, was saying, "I will take responsibility for both halves of this, for both parties." In other words, God was saying, "Abram, even if you can't keep the terms of this covenant, I am prepared to give my life to sort it." Now that's a covenant. And that's what that was. God ratified both parts of that deal, ensuring its eternal value and its eternal worth for Abram and for us. Jesus did the work, built the house, went to the cross, and he offers us the choice. And that story there comes out again and again in the New Testament. In fact, this chapter of the Old Testament is one of the chapters that has the most time given in the New Testament to interpreting and explaining it for our value, for our benefit, for our behalf. So, let's recap. Whose idea was the covenant? God's. Who sacrificed the animals? Abram. What then happened to Abram? He went to sleep. Who walked between the animals? God. Who bound himself to keeping both sides of the covenant, even if Abram couldn't? God. What was God saying by his actions? He was saying, "I'm a faithful God. I am a faithful God. I will do what I've promised. I will do it in my way. I will do it in my time, but I will do it. Do you trust me? Do you believe me?" That's what God was saying. This is grace. Abram had put belief and trust, faith in action. He'd done all that, and it was credited to him. But God showed him far more than Abram could ever have imagined. When God alone walked through those animals and took on all that it meant. Now, if you want the New Testament assurances and interpretations of this particular chapter, I'd recommend you read through Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, James, and Hebrews, because it's all there. And it's great. Once you've read this, to read what's said, you sort of get it. You think, wow, what a faithful God we have got. A covenant-keeping, promise-keeping God. And we can trust him and believe him. And he honors that in our lives and in our communities. He honors that. He's built the house. He's given it to you. And he's just saying, come on in. You're welcome. Amen. And we're going to finish with a song called Never Once have we been alone. He's always with us.